Well, here in Ottawa, Canada's spending watchdog says the cost of the F-35 fighter jet program is soaring. In 2022, the Defense Department said it would cost $19 billion to buy 88 new jets. But in a report released today, the Auditor General says the price tag rose to an estimated $27.7 billion last year, up nearly 50%. And the Auditor General says there will be more infrastructure and weapons to pay for on top of all of that, adding an additional $5.5 billion to reach full operational capacity. In response to that today, the Defense Minister blamed factors outside of Canada's control.
All of our NATO partners are affected by these factors. One was inflation. Obviously, we've seen an inflationary pressure on materials, logistical chains, supplies, construction, engineering. The second was, of course, the pandemic. And not only was Canada deeply affected by the pandemic and the United States, but every participating NATO partner.
The Auditor General of Canada, Karen Hogan, joins me now. Ms. Hogan, it's good to see you again. Thank you for coming in.
Thanks for having me.
So the Defense Minister, David McGuinty, in responding to your F-35 report today, says it shows issues all NATO countries are dealing with or dealt with, like inflation and the pandemic, and that's a big part of the cost increase. But how much responsibility does the department actually bear beyond those external factors?
So I'd tell you there were two big elements that contributed to the cost increase from $19 billion to $27.7 billion. For this project. Some of it well within the control of national defense. So for example, that first estimate of $19 billion was based on outdated information. There was more up-to-date information about the cost of planes that they could have used in order to have a better estimate of what the purchase of the 88 planes and all the related equipment and training and IT and software would have cost. But then, yes, there are elements that were outside of national defense's control, such as the impact that inflation, fluctuations in foreign currency would have, and really the global demand for munitions and other military equipment. So some was within their control, some was not. But I think this points to the need for a more focused monitoring of costs and risks, because they had identified that foreign exchange and inflation would be risks and weren't doing a good job at monitoring them.
Right, certainly something this big, this significant, to purchase this large in particular, right? That a regular annual update on costing even would make sense, but that sort of practice just wasn't there. You say they were more reactive than proactive on doing.
Well, in their risk management, they were definitely more reactive than proactive. Something came up and then a plan was developed in some instances. And for example, they knew that foreign exchange was something to monitor, but weren't doing it on a regular basis. But one of the recommendations we did issue was about a more regular update on costs and monitoring. It should be done at least annually, but on a project that goes over such a large period of time and involves a large sum of money, I would expect there would be more regular monitoring and then public reporting about the global cost.
So when they announced this, is what, 2022, 2023, when they announced that they were moving ahead with these jets? They used 2019 numbers, even though years had passed, COVID had happened, the post-COVID inflation was ripping through the global economy. There was a war in Europe driving up the price of munitions, and none of that got baked into the sticker price when they told us about it.
And the program office that really includes representatives from all nations offers up an annual update on the costs of planes as you decide to commit and enter into the purchase. And so there was updated information that was available that could have improved that original $19 billion estimate.
Okay, so right out of the gate, there was a problem with the costing, but you've also said there's infrastructure and advanced weapons costs that will add about $5.5 billion on top of the $27.7 billion, and a 3-year delay on the facilities for the jets. Canada's going to have to look at interim solutions, and that's going to add to the cost. So what are we looking at here? A $19 billion initial project is now north of 30, 32, 33 billion. Is that what we're talking?
So I think it's reasonable to expect that a project that's this large, that's in foreign currency, will have some fluctuations, and you'll see some cost increases for sure. When it comes to the extra additional cost, the $5.5 billion, I think this speaks to how national defense manages its projects. So they had a certain project defined for the 88 aircraft and the related equipment, and then realized that they needed to do extra updates to infrastructure like power grid modernization. And so they started a new project. And I think that it's important to give parliamentarians and Canadians the global picture, which includes the fact that the planes should carry missiles, and that should be included in at least the initial cost, so you can really understand what it will cost Canada to transition from the CF-18s to the CF-35.
So is this a problem with them buying the F-35 in particular, that there's something more costly about this plane than, say, the other options? Or is this just project management practice and lack of proactive response to things as things changed?
Well, no matter what plane Canada purchases, they're going to need new updated infrastructure, and that's exactly why National Defense, before they had decided to buy the CF-35s, had realized that they needed to start modernizing their facilities in Cold Lake and Bagotville and really across the country. But when they decided on the F-35s, they then had to make even more significant changes to those plans, which is why there is about a 3-year delay on significant infrastructure. But no matter what plane you pick, you're going to need modernized infrastructure. You're also going to need trained pilots. And that's why those two risks are something that really should be better managed.
Well, that's one of the key things you talked about here. There's a pilot shortage, right? So we're 88 planes, and I do want to ask you about the possibility of this being reviewed in a second, but how severe is the pilot shortage right now? Like, is there a plan in place for the Air Force to have a trained cadre of pilots to fly the fleet of planes when they're all here and operational?
So if you recall, back in 2018, my office did some work on the CF-18s, and at that time we highlighted a potential pilot shortage. And we're seeing the same risks still being present now that we're transitioning to CF-35s. National Defense has a plan in place, but their current plan predicts that they will not have enough qualified pilots when all the planes are expected to arrive in Canada. And that's why a much more close monitoring of that, mitigation measures need to be in place. And the plan needs to change. You're going to need trained, qualified pilots when all those aircraft arrive.
Well, what kind of gap are we talking here? Because when the order is fully fulfilled and delivered, there's going to be 88 CF-35s in the fleet. I would assume one pilot per plane. You need a minimum, and then people to spell them off and do different things. But how short are we going to be of full operational capacity when and if all of these planes are actually delivered to Canada?
So the number of trained pilots and the gap that exists is something that National Defense has classified. So I can't share that kind of information with you, but the fact remains is that they estimate there will be a shortage, and something needs to be done now to help fix that shortage.
Okay, can you clarify, there's a discrepancy in what the minister and his office are saying about the number of F-35s being delivered within the next year. They say they're getting 16. That's what the contract calls for. Your report suggests 8 are going to come in 2026. Why the delta of 8 there? Explain the gap.
Okay, so there's a lot of information going on here. Originally, the government gave National Defense the authority to purchase 16 planes.
Right.
They're doing that in waves. And so in 2025, they committed and entered into a commitment with the U.S. government to buy 4 full planes and then parts for 8 more. So that's 12 planes so far. Their intent is to go up to 88, but right now they have approval to just buy 16. So they're partway there. When you're looking at when the planes arrive, the first 8 planes are expected to be delivered to the United States in 2026, and those planes are to help train the pilots. But the first planes arrive in Canada on the current plan in 2028.
Okay, so it's I guess, question of it taking ownership of it and then bringing it home. And so will it be 16 in 2026, or is it 8? Because we do hear this from the minister of 16 planes for next year. We've heard it from a couple of ministers. Will that actually be the way it unfolds?
So all I can tell you is the commitment they entered into right now. They entered into a commitment for 4 planes and parts for 8 more. There's a long lead time for some parts, and so they pre-ordered some of those parts. But as I say, they've been approved to buy 16, but they're doing it in waves, and the first wave is 4.
Okay, so you talked about the cost, the pilot shortage, the need to change and tweak facilities to accommodate specific planes. There is a review happening of this contract. I don't know if they're going to go and not buy the balance of the 88 and go with the Gripen or some other plane from Europe. But adding even more diversity to the fleet seems like it compounds some of these challenges and costs in terms of pilot training, maintenance, and specific facilities. Is that a risk potentially to the cost of this replacement program?
Well, I think any change in the current course of action will add new risks that need to be managed and potentially new costs. But regardless of the plane that is purchased, you're going to need facilities where there'll be extra security measures or extra tweaking to that facility based on a different aircraft. I can't predict what the future will look like, but I can guarantee you that they will need sufficient trained pilots. And so that plan needs to be adjusted now to make sure that they're on track to have the right number of pilots by the time the fleet arrives.
Right. So it's a big week for defense money. You've put an extra $8 billion or so into the price tag for the planes and $5 billion for future infrastructure and munitions needs. We saw an infusion of cash, though, from the government this week when Mark Carney announced plans to hit the 2% NATO target. What do you think, based on the auditing you've done, needs to change in the procurement and management processes of D&D for that money to get used effectively? What are the underlying challenges that the CAF faces and the procurement and government faces when it comes to defense in particular?
So I think the Canadian Armed Forces is faced at times with decisions that change, and so it's important for the government to decide what the Canadian Armed Forces should look like and what it needs for equipment so that the public service can deliver on that. I would expect, as we recommended, that there would be a much closer monitoring of costs, a regular update of that, at least once a year in some public reporting. But really that risk management is so much more proactive instead of reactive. Those will help you manage any project, regardless of whether it's one plane or multiple planes, and short-term or long-term. So those are just good project management principles that I expect national defense will need to beef up as they spend more.
Okay, speaking of some management principles, you gave an update on the contracting challenges with consultants in particular focused on GC strategies, which was a significant political controversy over the last number of years. The conclusions mirror what you've seen in previous reports on GC strategies, what you saw with contracts going to McKinsey, ignored procurement rules, not demonstrating value for money. And it's to the point that in a rare move, you didn't make any recommendations because essentially it's follow your rules and clean this up. I know these are backwards looking. Is there any way to assess whether they are doing better in terms of following rules and living up to what the letter of the regulations say the civil servants who give out these contracts should be following?
So this report was really responding to a unanimous motion in the House of Commons that asked me to go look at all contracts awarded to GC strategies, and that was following our work on ArriveCAN. So I didn't expect that we would see something different, and the audit confirmed exactly the statement I made after the first report on professional services, was that I had no reason to believe that the lack of rules the fact that rules weren't being followed was unique to a specific vendor. And what we're seeing is another 31 federal organizations in this audit that at times ignored some or many of the procurement rules. I think time will tell whether changes that came out from ArriveCAN will result in a different approach to procurement. But for me, it was clear that the government didn't need more procurement rules. They needed to make sure that public servants understand the ones that exist and then that they're applied. And I do think they need to take a step back to say, is it too complex? Are there too many rules that people don't know them all? Are there too many rules so people are speeding up the process and going around them? What is the root cause for the behavior that we're seeing when the rules are meant to ensure transparency, accountability, and good value for money?
Right, but this one found a similar set of problems in a similar set of contracts in the same time period. So people shouldn't necessarily look at this and say nothing has changed because there were changes made after, and you haven't assessed that yet.
That's right. There were changes made after. This is going back to the same time. What this is adding in is more departments and crowns with similar behaviors. And that's why time will tell whether changes that have been made and changes that are coming again this summer in procurement will have a different impact.
Okay. Auditor General Karen Hogan, always appreciate the time. Thanks for coming in.
Thank you.